The wedding had gone off without a hitch. Jake, my best friend since high school, looked happier than I'd ever seen him. His new wife, Amanda, glowed with that post-ceremony bliss, and the reception was one for the books. Open bar, great food, and a live band that kept everyone on their feet all night. Candace, my wife of 7 years, was one of Amanda's bridesmaids. She looked breathtaking in her emerald green dress, the kind of beauty that made me remember why I married her. She laughed easily, danced with everyone, and radiated joy. I spent most of the night watching her, my chest tight with pride. She was magnetic, the kind of woman who drew people in wherever she went. But looking back now, I can't help but wonder if it was all an act. By the time midnight rolled round, the party was winding down. Guests were either drunk, dancing poorly, or slumped in their chairs. I had a headache from the champagne and decided to call it a night. Candace was still on the dance floor, spinning around with the other bridesmaids, but she'd kissed me on the cheek and told me she'd be up soon. "I'll just finish a few dances," she said, her voice light and playful. "Go ahead and get some rest." So I did, or at least I tried. The room was dimly lit, the heavy curtains blocking out the moonlight. I lay on the bed in my dress shirt and slacks, staring at the ceiling, willing sleep to come. But something felt off. My head throbbed, but it wasn't just the champagne. It was a gut feeling, a gnawing unease I couldn't shake. After tossing and turning for what felt like an hour, I decided to check on Candace. Maybe she'd gotten caught up saying goodnight to Amanda or helping Jake with some last-minute task. It wasn't unusual for her to play the social butterfly. The hallway was quiet, the faint hum of the air conditioning the only sound. Most of the guests had already retreated to their rooms, and the staff was beginning to clean up the reception hall. As I walked toward the staircase, I passed a partially open door. I didn't think much of it at first, but then I heard a sound, low and guttural, a man's grunt. My stomach tightened and my footsteps slowed. I should have walked away, told myself it wasn't my business, but something, curiosity, instinct, pulled me closer. I stepped toward the door, my pulse quickening with every inch. Then I saw them. There stood Candace, her bridesmaid dress hiked up to her waist, her legs wrapped around him. The best man, Jake's younger brother, Nathan, had his pants around his ankles, his hands gripping her hips as he thrust into her. The sounds they made, hers breathy and high-pitched, his deep and primal, rattled in my ears like a nightmare come to life. My mind couldn't process it. It was as if my brain refused to accept what my eyes were seeing. This wasn't my wife. This wasn't the woman I'd kissed goodbye earlier. The woman I'd vowed to love and cherish. It couldn't be. And yet, there she was. I wanted to burst in, to tear Nathan off her, to scream, to demand an explanation. But my feet stayed rooted to the spot, as if they were glued to the carpet. My hands trembled and my breath caught in my throat. They didn't even notice me. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, though it was probably only a few seconds. I didn't know whether to vomit, cry, or throw the nearest object through the wall. All I knew was that something inside me had shattered. Finally, I backed away, my legs shaking as I turned and stumbled down the hall. My vision blurred, my chest heaved, and I felt like I might collapse. But I couldn't stay there. I couldn't face them. Not yet. Back in my room, I locked the door and sat on the edge of the bed, my head in my hands. The image of them burned in my mind, playing on a loop I couldn't turn off. Every moan, every grunt, every movement replayed in excruciating detail. Who was this woman I thought I knew? The woman I'd built a life with, shared dreams with? I wanted to storm back into that room and demand answers, but another part of me, the part that was crumbling, feared the truth. And so I sat there, my heart pounding, my world unraveling. I had no idea what I was going to do next. I don't know how long I sat there, my mind racing, my body trembling with rage and disbelief. Every second that passed felt like gasoline being poured onto an already roaring fire. My hands clenched into fists, and my jaw tightened until it felt like my teeth would shatter. It wasn't just what I'd seen, it was who it was with. Nathan. Jake's arrogant little brother, always flashing that smug grin, like the world owed him something. The way he strutted around at the wedding, cracking jokes at my expense, like I wasn't good enough to be standing up there beside Jake. I had chalked it up to typical Nathan bravado. But now I knew better. I didn't even realize I was moving until I was standing outside their door again. The sounds had stopped, replaced by muffled voices and occasional laughter. Laughter. They were laughing. My wife and the best man were laughing. That was it. I saw red. I slammed the door open so hard it crashed against the wall, the sound echoing down the hall. Candace screamed and scrambled off Nathan, clutching her dress to her chest, her eyes wide with shock and terror. Nathan fell back onto the bed, his bare legs tangling in the sheets as he scrambled to cover himself. "What the hell?" Nathan started, but he didn't get to finish. My fist connected with his jaw before he even had a chance to stand. The satisfying crack of bone against bone filled the room as his head snapped back, and he toppled off the bed, hitting the floor with a dull thud. Candace shrieked again, backing away toward the corner of the room, her hands trembling as she tried to fix her dress. "You think you can do this to me?" I roared, my voice raw and unrecognizable. "You think you can screw my wife and just walk away?" Nathan groaned, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth as he tried to sit up. "Look, man, I didn't let him finish. I grabbed him by the collar of his shirt, half buttoned and hanging off his shoulders, and yanked him to his feet. His eyes darted to the door, but there was no escape. Not tonight. "Man, calm down," he stammered, his hands coming up defensively. "It's not what you think." "Not what I think?" I bellowed, slamming him against the wall so hard the picture frames rattled. "I saw you, you piece of—" He swung at me, a weak, desperate punch that barely grazed my shoulder. It was enough to ignite every ounce of fury inside me. I drove my knee into his gut, knocking the wind out of him, then shoved him to the floor. Candace finally found her voice. "Stop it! Tim, please, just stop!" Her words were like a dagger to the chest. She was pleading for him? After what I'd just seen? I turned to her, my chest heaving, and pointed a trembling finger. "You don't get to say a damn word. Not after what you've done." Tears streamed down her face, but I didn't care. Not this time. "It wasn't—" she started, but I cut her off. "Shut up," I spat, my voice venomous. "You don't get to explain this away. Not now, not ever." Nathan groaned from the floor, trying to crawl toward the bed. "Just let me go, man," he muttered, his voice weak. "You've made your point." But I wasn't done. Not by a long shot. I grabbed him by the back of his shirt and dragged him to the door, ignoring his pathetic protests. Candace screamed for me to stop, but I didn't even glance her way. I threw the door open and shoved him into the hallway, sending him sprawling onto the carpet. "Get the hell out of here," I growled, my voice low and dangerous. "And if I ever see your face again, I swear to God, you'll regret it." He scrambled to his feet, his face pale and bloodied, and bolted down the hallway, his pants still hanging loosely around his hips. I stood there, breathing heavily, watching him disappear around the corner. When I turned back to the room, Candace was sitting on the edge of the bed, her face buried in her hands. Her shoulders shook as she sobbed, but I felt no sympathy. Not anymore. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me, the sound of the lock clicking into place making her flinch. "Tim, please," she whispered, her voice cracking. I made a mistake. It didn't mean anything." "Didn't mean anything?" I repeated, my voice cold. "You destroyed our marriage for nothing?" Her sobs grew louder, but I didn't care. "You don't even get it, do you?" I said, my voice shaking with rage. "This isn't just about tonight. This is about every time you looked me in the eye and lied. Every time you pretended to love me while screwing someone else." She opened her mouth to respond, but I held up a hand. "Save it," I said. "I don't want your excuses. I don't want your apologies. I just want you out of my life." Her tears flowed freely now, but I turned away. I couldn't stand to look at her anymore. My hands were still trembling, my knuckles raw from hitting Nathan, but I felt no regret, only a cold, empty fury. As I walked out of the room, I knew one thing for sure. This was only the beginning. They'd both pay for what they'd done, and I wouldn't rest until they did. I didn't sleep that night. Hell, I didn't even go back to the room. I spent the early hours of the morning sitting in my truck in the hotel parking lot, replaying everything in my mind. My hands were still shaking from the fight, the metallic tang of blood from my split knuckles lingering in my mouth. Revenge was all I could think about. Cold, calculated revenge. I wasn't going to let them walk away from this unscathed. They'd humiliated me, betrayed me, and shattered my life. Now it was my turn. By dawn, I had a plan. First, I called Jake. It was early, too early, but I didn't care. He picked up on the third ring, his voice groggy. Tim, what's up, man? It's 6 in the morning. I need you to meet me, I said, my voice steady but icy. Now. No questions. Just get dressed and come to the lobby. Jake didn't argue. He must have heard something in my tone because he was there in 10 minutes, still in sweatpants and a wrinkled t-shirt. As he approached, I handed him a manila folder. Inside were the photos I'd taken of Nathan and Candace last night, moments before the fight broke out. Jake opened the folder and his face went pale. What the hell is this? He whispered, his hands trembling as he flipped through the pictures. It's your brother, I said flatly, and my wife. He stared at me, his jaw clenched, his eyes narrowing with rage. You've got to be kidding me. I wish I was. Jake was a hothead, always had been. He stormed off without another word, muttering curses under his breath, and I knew he was heading straight for Nathan's room. That was step one. Step two involved Candace. She'd been texting me all morning, begging for forgiveness, claiming she was out of her mind last night and made a terrible mistake. I ignored her until I was ready, letting her stew in her guilt. When I finally called, my voice was calm, calculated. Meet me at the coffee shop across from the hotel, I said. We need to talk. She arrived 20 minutes later, her hair pulled into a messy bun, her makeup smeared from crying. She looked like hell, and for once I didn't care. I let her sit across from me, fidgeting and sniffling while I sipped my coffee, the silence stretching between us. Tim, she started, but I cut her off. You don't get to explain, I said, my tone sharp. You don't get to spin this into some sob story where you're the victim. I know who you are now, and I want you to listen to me very carefully. Her eyes widened, and she nodded silently. I'm filing for divorce, I said. You'll get nothing. No alimony, no share of the house, no access to my savings. I've already spoken to a lawyer, and the evidence I have, it's more than enough to ruin you in court. Tim, please, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. We can fix this. We can go to counseling. I leaned forward, my voice dropping to a near growl. Counseling? You think some therapist is going to undo what you did? You think I'll ever forget seeing you with him? She sobbed, but I didn't stop. This isn't just about me, I continued. It's about the lies you told, the betrayal, the way you made me look like a fool in front of everyone. So, here's how this is going to go. I laid it out for her in cold, clinical terms. I'd expose her affair to her family, her friends, and her coworkers, if she even thought about fighting the divorce. I'd make sure everyone knew who she really was. She nodded through her tears, her spirit visibly breaking. Step 3. Nathan. Jake wasn't the only one I told. By lunchtime, I'd made a few strategic phone calls, to Jake's parents, to Amanda, and even to a few of the groomsmen who'd known Nathan for years. The fallout was swift and brutal. By the time I returned to the hotel, Nathan was being dragged out of his room by Jake, who was shouting loud enough to wake the entire floor. You're not my brother anymore, Jake bellowed. You're dead to me, you hear me? You're done. Amanda was in the background, sobbing into her maid of honor's arms, while the hotel staff tried unsuccessfully to calm things down. I stood in the hallway, arms crossed, watching the chaos unfold with grim satisfaction. Nathan spotted me as Jake shoved him toward the elevator. His face was a mix of fury and shame, his mouth opening like he wanted to say something. But I just smirked and turned away. The final piece of my revenge was the cherry on top. Nathan had always bragged about his social media following, how his image as the golden boy entrepreneur had earned him thousands of adoring fans. That night, I sent the photos to a few well-placed accounts. By morning, the scandal was trending. Best man fails. By the time I walked out of that hotel for the last time, Nathan's reputation was in shambles. Candace's pleas had fallen on deaf ears, and I felt something I hadn't in hours. Peace. Was it cruel? Maybe. But for once, I didn't care. They'd burned my life to the ground. I just made sure they burned with it. The thing about Candace's family is they'd always looked at me like I wasn't good enough for her. Her mother, Judith, was a socialite who spent more time gossiping at brunches than raising her kids. Her father, Raymond, was a man of money, not morals, and didn't hesitate to remind me every chance he got that I'd married up. At first, I ignored their jabs. I didn't come from money, but I worked hard and provided for Candace. I thought over time they'd come to respect me. But now they were part of my revenge. They'd always worshipped the image of Candace as their perfect daughter, the glowing wife, the center of attention at every holiday dinner. It was time to shatter that illusion. The first strike came at dinner the following Sunday. Candace had begged me not to tell her parents. "Please, Tim," she'd cried, "they'll disown me. They'll never forgive me." I'd smiled at her, cold and empty. "Good," I said. When Judith called to invite me to the family's weekly dinner, I accepted. "I'll be there," I told her. "I have a lot to share." I arrived alone, letting myself in as I always had. Candace wasn't there yet, but I could tell from the tense energy in the room that she'd warned them something was coming. Judith was perched on the couch, sipping wine like it was her shield, while Raymond sat in his armchair, the master of his domain. "Tim," Judith greeted, her tone clipped. "Candace says you've had a disagreement." "Oh, you could call it that," I said, sitting across from them and pulling out my phone. "But I'd call it betrayal." Without another word, I showed them the pictures. Judith gasped, the wine glass slipping from her hand and crashing to the floor. Raymond's face turned an unhealthy shade of red as he leaned forward, his jaw tightening. "That's Candace," he muttered, his voice shaking. "And who's the man?" "Jake's brother," I said. "The best man. Thought you'd want to know the kind of woman you raised." Judith clutched her chest like I'd just shot her. "This can't be real," she whispered, shaking her head. "Candace wouldn't—" "She did," I interrupted, "and it wasn't the first time." The fallout was immediate. Raymond erupted, pacing the room and shouting about how Candace had shamed the family. Judith cried, her tears less about betrayal and more about the scandal that would inevitably spread. I watched them unravel with a quiet satisfaction. These were people who cared more about appearances than anything real. And now, their perfect daughter had made them the center of their own drama. It wasn't enough to just humiliate them privately, though. No, I wanted their friends, their social circle, to know exactly what kind of family they were. I started small, casually leaking details to mutual acquaintances. A word here, a hint there. It didn't take long for the rumors to spread. At first, Judith and Raymond tried to play damage control, spinning it as a misunderstanding between me and Candace. But then the photos surfaced online, plastered across their social feeds by accounts they couldn't control. Within days, the whispers turned into full-blown scandal. Judith stopped showing up to her brunches, and Raymond canceled a golf outing he'd been planning for weeks. Candace's siblings called, furious, accusing her of dragging the family through the mud. The final nail in the coffin came at Raymond's company fundraiser a few weeks later. It was one of those black tie events they loved to throw, with donors, investors, and local politicians rubbing elbows over champagne and caviar. I wasn't invited, of course, but I didn't need to be. I had a friend on the catering staff, a guy I'd done some favors for in the past, and he owed me. With his help, I arranged for a little surprise. Halfway through the evening, just as Raymond was giving his keynote speech about family values and integrity, the screens behind him lit up. The photos. Candace and Nathan, in all their glory, displayed for every guest to see. The gasps, the murmurs, the sheer chaos that followed. It was everything I'd hoped for. Raymond froze, his face ashen, as the room erupted around him. Judith fled, her heels clicking against the marble floor as she covered her face with her hands. And Candace? She wasn't even there to witness the fallout. I didn't stay to see the aftermath firsthand, but I heard about it from my friend. The event was ruined, investors pulled out, and Raymond's reputation took a massive hit. They tried to downplay it as a malicious attack, but no one bought it. By the end of it, Candace's family was in shambles. They'd spent years looking down on me, treating me like I wasn't good enough. Now, they were the ones facing judgment. And me? I walked away from it all with my head held high. I wasn't the perfect husband, but I wasn't the man who broke his vows. That was all on Candace. And now, she could live with the ashes of the life she'd set on fire. By the time I left that hotel for good, I'd scorched everything Candace and her family had built. Her affair wasn't just a betrayal of our marriage. It was a betrayal of every sacrifice I'd made, every promise we'd shared. And I wasn't about to let her or anyone else walk away unscathed. But revenge is a curious thing. It fills you with purpose in the moment. But once the flames die down, you're left with the ashes. That's where I found myself as I walked out of the courtroom weeks later, the divorce finalized, and Candace officially out of my life. In the end, she didn't fight me. How could she? Between the photos, the text logs, and her complete disgrace in front of her family and friends, she didn't have a leg to stand on. I got the house, my savings, and, most importantly, my freedom. She moved out and left me with the memories of a life I no longer recognized. Her family stopped contacting me after the fundraiser debacle. I heard through mutual acquaintances that Judith and Raymond had cut Candace off financially, refusing to help her fix the mess she'd created. Nathan, of course, wasn't faring any better. He'd lost his job at Jake's company, blacklisted after Jake found out about the affair. The last I heard, he'd moved out of state, tail tucked between his legs. Good riddance to them both. But as much as I wanted to celebrate my so-called victories, there was no satisfaction in sitting alone in the empty house I'd once called home. The silence was suffocating, the memories clawing at me every time I turned a corner. I'd gotten my revenge, sure, but it hadn't erased the betrayal or the heartbreak. One night I stood in the bedroom, the same room where Candace and I had laughed, shared dreams, and eventually destroyed each other. The bed was stripped bare, the dresser half empty. I stared at the bare walls and felt the weight of it all pressing down on me. That's when I knew it was time to let go. The next morning, I called a realtor. I didn't need the house anymore. It wasn't a home. It was a graveyard of broken promises and tainted memories. Within weeks, I'd packed up my things, sold the property, and left the town where Candace and I had built our life together. I didn't know where I was going, but that didn't matter. For the first time in years, I felt free. Free from the lies, the judgment, and the weight of a marriage that had suffocated me for far too long. Months later, I found myself on the other side of the country, living in a small apartment overlooking the ocean. Life was quieter, simpler. I picked up new hobbies, made new friends, and slowly began to piece myself back together. Every so often, I'd think about Candace, where she was, what she was doing. Did she regret what she'd done? Did she miss the life we'd shared? Or was she too busy blaming everyone but herself for the mess she'd created? I didn't care. Not anymore. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson, I sat on my balcony with a glass of whiskey. The waves crashed against the shore, steady and rhythmic, a reminder that life goes on no matter what. For the first time in a long time, I smiled. Not because everything was perfect, it wasn't, but because I'd survived. I'd walked through the fire, come out the other side, and found something Candace could never take from me. Peace. And that was enough.